the act of farming in this way is fundamentally a political act.
Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. Roni Selects is a preeminent importer and distributor of natural wines based in Los Angeles, and Roni Ginach is its founder. She was the former wine director for the renowned restaurant Michael's of Santa Monica until she was given the opportunity to help distribute wine for California's grandfather of natural wine, Tony Coturri. From there, a new career was born. Now Roni represents winemakers from France, Germany, Italy, the US, and Georgia, and more. And as you'll hear, she balances her time between navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth required to move wine from one side of the world to the other, and visiting and relishing the beauty of the people and places where the wines are produced. Along the way, she's helping to shape industry awareness about the importance of natural, regenerative, organic wine growing and making practices, to the quality and deliciousness of wine, as well as the need to eliminate some of the dogma around natural wine righteousness and how natural wine can be a more inclusive segment of the industry. Roni's story highlights her love and appreciation for the amazing wines that are a result of deep passion for farming grapes holistically with care and respect for the earth, a kind of agriculture that is, unfortunately, still somewhat radical and even subversive. Enjoy. Hi, Roni. Thanks so much for talking with me.
Anytime.
You are the founder of Roni Selects, which is an import and distribution company for natural wine, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so how does one wake up one day and decide to become a natural wine importer?
Well, good question.
Like what experience had you had that led you to start Roni?
There was no world in which there was a day that I woke up and said, "Today's the day I become a natural wine importer." It happened like many things in life, sort of by accident. Many great things. I was working as a sommelier in a few restaurants in Los Angeles and in New York a bit before that, and this is sort of a long story, so I'll just get into it. I guess that's the point of this long story.
Yeah, please.
So,
Yeah. And feel free to drop names of the restaurants, because I know you were at some really great restaurants too.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think that it was during the time I was at Michael's in Santa Monica, and I had at some point been traveling around Texas, and I stopped. I was in the hill country in Texas, and I looked up natural wine hill country, and there was one name that popped up, and it was a winery called La Cruz de Comal, and the winemaker's name is Louis Dixon, So I wrote him an email, and I was like, I'm in the area. I'm this is who I am. Can I come by and see you? And he didn't respond. So a couple days later, I just showed up at the winery, and during his technically open hours, which are Saturdays, and he was wonderful, like the most welcoming. He's just like one of those big characters. Like, he was a criminal defense attorney. He has like the second largest collection of Chicano painting and sculpture, second only to Cheech Marin, and
wow.
we fell in love, to say the least. So when he came to LA for Raw that fall, he basically needed some help pouring, so I offered to help him pour. And he was trained by Tony Coturri, and they've been good friends since the early 80s. Trained by, and sort of Tony helped him get started. So he'd been there consulting on like the vineyard practices from the time that Louis planted his vines, which at this point is, I'm not going to actually say how long it is because I don't remember the exact number, but it's been a while, between 15 and around 15 years, let's say, plus or minus. And so they're good friends. They're like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It's like, they just poke at each other and they make jokes. And so I spent this whole weekend with these crazy old men, and they would like it if I said, I'm not being ageist. They call themselves that. They celebrate their maturity and their wisdom. And so so Tony at the time didn't have any distribution in California. and we were sort of putting our heads together. I've been working as a somm for a number of years, and I sort of knew everybody in the field at that point. And I was like, we were trying to find the right fit, and he'd been approached by some people, but I was like, no, that doesn't seem right. His wines are complicated, and they need to be sort of hand sold often. At the time, I don't know, this was 3 years ago or so. It was a different moment in natural wine. And so I was like, okay, look, Tony, I'll help you sell your wines until you find somebody real. And so I was just working at Michael's, and I was selling wine for other people. I was working for a company called Scuola di Vino at the time, and before that, maybe at the same time, also for another company called Roni Selects, which is a wonderful portfolio of mostly French wines. Yeah. And so it wasn't random. I had those relationships already, and I was like, oh, I'll just tack on one. So after Tony, a couple more domestic producers were like, well, we're hearing you're selling Tony's wines and you're doing pretty well. Can you sell my wines too? And I was like, oh, you know what? Why not? And then slowly but surely it became more producers, and then I was like spending more time on working with their wines than I was on my day job. And it gets to the point where, I think the point where you have to make a choice, where you're like, okay, this is the thing that brings me big joy, selling wine for producers, working directly with them. And it can lead to a very interesting and dynamic life of traveling, of big relationships. And I was also getting to the point at the same time where I was like losing joy in working service. So it was a good time. So eventually I took a leap and started to pursue it. And since then, I was working briefly with a business partner. It didn't work out. We had we started to grow a little bit. And then from there, I sort of ended up with about 25, 30 producers at the beginning of this year, and have since started to distribute 2 other portfolios of sort of comparable size or bigger. So the book has grown. It's not only my imports now, it's also Goat Boy selections and Owen Cutler selections, all under one umbrella. And that's the long and short of it.
So just a quick question. You maybe it won't be a quick question, but you described Tony's wines as complicated. What do you mean?
Well, I guess it's not a quick question, just to warn you in advance. I
hope.
Yeah. So from what I can tell, when I started working as a somm in Los Angeles 6 years ago or something, it wasn't very long ago. That's when I moved here. There were a few people selling natural wine, a few portfolios selling natural wine, and a few people buying it for restaurants. And it wasn't a thing. It wasn't, and like there were many people who were like, oh no, I won't drink that. It's weird. Like there were 2 shops, and it was definitely still an anomaly. And I always made jokes about how like we don't do this for the money. There's no money in natural wine. We're never gonna be mainstream or whatever. Now It's a different story. And Tony's been making wine naturally, like no sulfur and no additions, nothing, since his first commercial vintage in 1981. He's been making wine since 79. And his wines, he picks late. He picks later than most other people, and uses the sugar as sort of a natural preservative. And there's nobody else that I know of whose wines sort of age, whose wines age the way that his do. Like they're within the natural wine sphere. We also just don't have the like luxury of time to see that. So he's one of the few producers that have been working consistently that way. And
like underline that approach as unique, the idea of using sugar to preserve, because I would say 99% of natural wine is the opposite. It's pick real early and use acid to preserve.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of fascinating. I would love to hear more about that.
That's the thing that you should definitely talk to Tony about, because he's got a lot to say. And I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a winemaker, so I can't get into the details I believe I'm from I believe what he tells me. So it works. So he always says the thing that I use as a mantra in my regular life, but also in terms of the way that I perceive of wines, is that basically you can't decide what kind of you can't go into a vintage or a harvest having the wines that you want to make in mind. You have to wait until the grapes tell you what they're going to be. So, which is something that many natural winemakers don't do. So they want to make a skin contact. They want to make a skin contact Gruner that's at this Brix and this texture and this, and then we're going to manipulate it. So it becomes, in a way, a manipulated commodity, regardless of the desire for it to be natural. It doesn't have sulfur. It doesn't have, there was no spraying in the vineyards, but it still becomes a manipulated commodity. In a way, that's might be an unpopular perspective. But to get back to your original question, great. So the way that, because he picks late, they're really high in alcohol. They're between 14 and 15.5 for his wines. And that's what's listed. You know what I mean? You can't basically go above 15.5 and not call it fortified. So the wines are high in alcohol, which also, is one of the things that, obviously it's all connected to the sugar and the alcohol, but so they're high in alcohol and they're pretty dense, viscous. You can always tell a Coturri wine from the texture. In my mind, having, spent a lot of time with them, he's got it's the yeast in the winery. It's the barrels that he's using. It's it's all of the stuff that creates a style. So at that time, 4 years ago, probably there was, I think about 4 years ago, it was becoming more and more, status quo to open a restaurant and have a natural wine list. To Night and Market Song was doing super, super well. At that time, or 4 years ago, is when I was working with Kismet, and we opened at that point and had a totally natural wine list, and everyone, it was a big deal in the moment. But I think I also just felt protective over this guy who I just met. You know what I mean? One of the reasons why I was I just wanted him to find the right home. And it was a privilege for me to sell his wines. He's the grandfather of natural wine in California. And,
I did meet him.
Yeah. Was he grumpy?
Okay. I mean, I have a fondness piece, so I don't know.
Yeah. No, he's the best, honestly. I've it's been such a pleasure to work with him, and through him meet so many wonderful people. I work with Caleb, who works in his winery, and it's Caleb Leisure, and Côte de Caillou, Jacques Machu, who also makes wine at the Coturri compound. And then, since then, he introduced me to some other people, and it's sort of created this wonderful family of warm, loving, wonderful winemakers, All the winemakers that I work with?
No. That's what I was going to say. That sort of the connections, like Tony, and then their close connections there. But you are importing and clearly have expanded beyond this country. And it's funny. I just want to jump back and say, I just launched an episode a couple days ago with a guy who's doing something kind of special in Texas, and I need to put them in touch. Is La Cruz de Camal still happening?
Yeah, he's there. He's doing his thing. Who's the guy in Texas that you just? I'm sorry, I'm not up to date.
No, that's all right. It's all right. Alta Marfa is the project, and they're in Marfa, Texas. So it's way west Texas, underneath New Mexico, and they just planted a vineyard the last couple of years at 5,400 feet, so over a mile high.
Is it around Marfa, or is it further? There are a lot of vineyards
outside
around
of
Lubbock.
Marfa.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, no,
interesting.
It's outside of Marfa, in the middle of nowhere. Honestly, they had to sleep in tents when they were planting the vineyard. It's really interesting.
That's amazing.
Project. Yeah,
it's crazy around there. I've spent a lot of time there, and it's a very special landscape. I can't imagine how beautiful it would be with vines.
It did kind of surprise me that you said you were cruising through Texas and looking for natural wine. Not that you went to Texas for natural wine, but what did Texas like was?
I was in a relationship with somebody who lived in Marfa, actually. So I
That's hilarious. Okay.
Yeah, I was spending a lot of time.
You're the one person in Marfa.
Yeah, that's the thing. I spent ages around there. So it was, and I grew up in New York. and then moved to Los Angeles, as an adult. And growing up in New York is a wonderful thing to do, and it's one of the most incredible places, but it is also a very sort of sheltered existence. You don't know about America. You don't know how to. So the first time I actually went to visit, I went from New York and flew to visit Marfa. I learned my lesson so quickly about what America is, just sort of how to the scale of like Texas. I was like, okay, flying into San Antonio, which is a 6-hour drive, and I was like, okay, I'll drive it by myself, no big deal, in the 90-degree heat. And I'd never been to a place where there are hundreds of miles between gas stations, so
it's
it was
like frightening.
Yeah,
it's like your first,
and it did the worst case scenario. It's like that's the thing. My tire exploded. It was like almost ran out of gas. Everything was fine. I made it, but I really was like, oh, I need to wrap my head around. I've traveled a lot in the country, but I'd never spent I'd never really like understood the scale of the United States of America until that moment when I was standing on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in Texas in 95-degree heat, waiting for a tow truck, which didn't come. So
outside of
no. I mean, it was like that's an exaggeration, but I lived in Colorado for a bit when I was younger. It was, but my first experience in like in that part of the world, right, and like even and from here, basically from once you get into East Texas, it gets pretty sort of marshy and wet. So basically from that the middle of Texas over is all until you get here to Los Angeles, it's just all desert more or less along that route at least. So it's I kind of slowly sort of became interested in this landscape, but I think I also the desert speaks to me.
Yeah, I feel that. I spent like a month sleeping around Moab. Sleeping around sounds terrible. I spent camping around Moab, Utah, and the canyon lands and sort of the high desert of that area. And it is
so beautiful.
One of the most beautiful places on earth, and so surreal and like just otherworldly, really. And then you have nights where you can see more stars than you can see anywhere else in the world, and it's like literally like the sky is falling on you because so many things are shooting around. And it is
very crazy.
Something that everybody should try to get out and experience once or twice. It's really incredible, and you do understand why. Like, I mean, you had that experience of like why, if you're a rancher in Texas, you need to be pretty resourceful because there's nowhere to go for help. Like, it's on you. If you break down, it's like you have to be a mechanic, you have to be a farmer, you have to be everything, doctor,
Totally. But that's, I mean, the thing, I don't remember when it was, but I listened to an episode of Levi Dalton's podcast, I'll drink to that with an interview with a winemaker from Piedmont, this woman who had been living in Milan, like very cosmopolitan life, and then moved to Piedmont and started making wine. And she put it in a way that I always think about. Sort of when you live in the city, you're the god of your own domain. You can make all the decisions about what you want. If it's raining, you can go inside. You can find an umbrella, and weather doesn't affect you. You're in charge of your life in a way. And then when you move to the country, you become a winemaker or a farmer of any kind. You really realize how big and like powerful and the universe is, and how powerless you are within it. And I feel like it's an important thing to remember.
I mean, it's like we have a little bit of that in Los Angeles because we get earthquakes frequently enough to remind us that, to some degree we're out of, we don't control the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really well put. I think that's a really good lesson.
Absolutely.
Well, jumping back to importing, you slowly developed, and now you have a focus on specifically Georgia for a lot. I mean, you're excited about Georgia, at least. I don't know if you're focused entirely on Georgia, but could you talk a little bit about, before we get into some of like the great stories and people that you work with even deeper, let's talk about like just the realities of what's a day in the life, a week in the life of you as an importer, and how's that different than you know being a national distributor or just local distributor, or like talk about some of the bureaucracy you might have to deal with. I know tariffs have been a big deal lately. Anything that just to give us a picture of sort of like the nuts and bolts of what goes into.
Yeah, I mean, it's very boring. That part is very boring. So I'm not going to go into it in
Because
too
you're
much
dealing with
detail.
like
Yeah, I mean, it's
and
all
things like that,
paperwork.
right?
It's, I was on the phone with the FDA for an hour this morning to get an answer, to get basically to have them tell me that they can't give me the answer I need because it's classified. It's just like a lot of paper
Yeah,
pushers all over
yeah.
every different, and no matter, I think this is another thing. With Georgia specifically, every time I have a shipment from Georgia, it becomes the Georgian crisis, and that's how I refer in my house with my partner. And she's like, I can't hear about another Georgian crisis. I can't. This is too. There's always something that goes wrong. Whether it's the way the pellets are packed or how long it takes, or
Mm.
it's just there are many people involved and many hands that everything goes through, whether it's refrigerated or not. I mean, it's all like boring logistics. That's, you just have to.
Well, sort of that journey from this wonderful producer in the outback of Georgia to Los Angeles. The steps along the way are boring, but I guess what is exciting to me to highlight is the fact that the decisions that you make, and the decisions and you're making those because of the influence of the consumer, and the decisions that we consumers make, like really involve this global infrastructure of people's lives and well-beings and their livelihoods, you know just to get whatever, a $20 bottle of wherever, $30 bottle of something tasty for the dinner
Mhm,
table, is this a interconnected web of interdependence among humans. That is, I think that's what's interesting about
for
it. And
sure.
I guess I don't know, like that I mean,
No, I.
what, like, some of the, what is the journey of the bottle? So you have an importer who wants to I mean, you have a producer in Los
Mhm.
Angeles get here.
Good question. It really depends. There are a couple of things that it depends on. There are some companies, one of the ones that I work with, that basically um, they consolidate containers for a bunch of different importers. But let's say there's the details of what happens. Basically, there's a producer in France, for example, who makes some wine, and then it has to get picked up on a truck and taken to the port of wherever the closest port is in France. And then it's these pallets which were packed at the winery are consolidated onto containers, big shipping containers that are refrigerated. And then those go on big boats. And they either,
Right.
if they're going to New York, they go directly across the Atlantic. And if they're going to the West Coast, they have to go around Panama and come back up. So that's why it usually takes an extra month, more or less, to get wine to California than it does to New York or anywhere else on the East Coast. And then from there, it reaches the Port of Oakland most often, or I've never had anything go into Long Beach, but I assume that it can. And then it's picked up on another truck and moved to the warehouse, inbounded into the warehouse, and then it's eventually, usually about 2.5 to 3 months later, available to be shipped to accounts all over California.
Customs and
Exactly.
doing,
Yeah. So
and it's also, I
well, then
imagine,
it has
not
to, it
not a
gets sort
total
of
bad
shaken around again.
ship
So
again.
yeah.
Okay.
And then, yeah, finally from the warehouse, I have a little ordering system, and I put in an order and I say, send 3 cases of this to this account, and then it gets there. That's the end. That's the end of the
And are
cycle.
you right, sort of like
Yeah. Yeah.
well, just
No,
makes me
no,
think
no,
about
yeah. It's,
it.
I mean, the joy of this work is, luckily this is a thing that I am capable of doing. It's like within the skill set that I've developed over time. But it's also, this isn't where the joy is, the logistics
Right.
of
Sure.
um of getting wine from A
The
to B. I mean,
Navat. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the fun part is going to those places and finding the wines and finding the
Right.
people and developing the relationships. So
Ask you
yeah,
about significantly.
yeah, it's a real pain in the butt, to say the least. It's just a lot of cash.
Yeah.
It's like it's a lot of money that you're giving to no one,
Right.
and it feels like a real waste.
Right.
For a thing that, like, it's about the one that's in place right now is about, it's like about like it's about aircrafts, and it's very stupid. I mean, the whole thing has nothing to do with the
Yeah,
tariffs that we're dealing with. Or
with wine.
apparently
Yeah.
there was something now where the EU is allowed to impose restrictions on Boeing planes, so it's like punishing America back for these tariffs. So hopefully it'll
Right.
influence
Yeah.
them going forward. Anyway, the point is it's very stupid. I will also say that another thing that I've been dealing with or trying to figure out is, the whole shipping process. There are a lot of hands touching the wines at different points, and like it's a huge carbon emission. Like there's just like so much energy that's eaten during this time, like the trucking, the shipping.
That's what. Yeah.
So I'm like I'm trying to, one company that I work with records data about carbon emissions that seems to maybe not be accurate, but I'm trying to work with it, trying to find basically a way of calculating the total emissions from point of pickup to like final destination during the time that I basically own the wine. Roni Selects owns the wine,
Right.
and and then eventually once we can calculate it, we're gonna offset whatever or include the offsets, the cost of working with a company, hopefully that's doing work locally,
Right.
in terms of just like offset projects. But
Like
it's
Rufus Burnt kind of
exactly, yeah,
thing.
that kind of thing. I mean, there
Or
the whole
currently.
I was talking. Somebody the other day mentioned that like the process of using new glass every time is like a huge emission for winemakers. So even if we're working, even if we're practicing regenerative farming, there are always other things to take into account. It's not just what's happening in the
Right.
soil.
And I mean, I know that I just found out, like I was looking at a bottle company for our wines in New York, and I was like, oh great, it's like American made, da da da. And then because there's a big supplier for a lot of wines, a lot of wine bottles is in China,
Mhm.
and I'd considered that one. It was a little bit cheaper, but I was like, oh, it's American made. It's like, it doesn't have to cross an ocean. Well, then it turns out like driving a truck across America uses more emissions than a boat from China. So it's like, it's always sort of surprising as well, the kind of where the biggest impact is, and where, you're doing
Right,
good, you might much
right.
good, and you
Yeah, I
might
was
have to
always
just ship
thinking
things
like
entirely.
the winemakers are like a negative emission. You know what I mean? So I don't have to take that into consideration. But now, like
Right. Yeah.
someone bringing to, I mean, the idea of, yeah, of course, the glass, the capsules, the corks. It's not, no matter how much good work you do,
Yeah.
there's always another set of
And do you
factors.
like, stuff on user
I
end,
mean, not
or do you
necessarily.
encourage you having any of
I'm
them?
starting to have conversations. I mean, it's a lot about, there's I think a lot of the people that I work with are just trying to like figure out their marketing in
Yeah.
total. There are a couple of people who are thinking sort of holistically about emissions, and it's like a cost prohibitive, obviously, to like the whole process of calculating. I've talked to a couple of different companies that calculate emissions, and it's just like extravagantly expensive,
Mm.
to have them do the work that I can't figure out how to do because I'm not a professional
What?
calculator of carbon emissions. So it's
Oh,
no,
sorry.
go
Go
ahead, go
ahead.
ahead.
In a bulk in the
Eh,
U.S.
I mean,
Yeah.
people like Yellowtail do that. You know what I mean? It's like
Sure.
it
Yeah.
becomes, it's especially because most of the time the wines are aging in bottle for quite a long time. It's like
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
the drill. It's like
That's a whole
it's a whole
different thing,
different
of
thing.
course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there are a couple of producers I work with that keg their wines now, and
Yeah.
that's great. Unfortunately, when COVID started, it became sort of impossible to sell wine in kegs because there are
Right.
no wine bars.
Yeah. Right.
So it's we can, in a vacuum, there are ways in which we can all make small changes, but obviously like the complexity of marketing, the complexity of like living through a global pandemic, and all make any decision arbitrary in a way. At least that's anyway.
Causing us to reevaluate a lot of things, but then it's also just put a lot of things on hold. We can't reevaluate. We just sort of have to. We know that things will eventually be different again
Right.
in a different way.
Yeah.
um, yeah. Well, so all of this talk kind of led to a hard question I wanted to ask you, which is there something inherently paradoxical or contradictory about importing natural wine? given these kind of considerations.
I mean, if you're
And
only
the values from which they're produced, the sort of community and local, natural vibe from just that specific place. And then
I mean, if you're only thinking about like the ecological impact, then yes, for sure. I mean, I'm not gonna tell you that the majority of people working in that everybody's a hypocrite. Obviously,
yeah,
we live in this is 2020. We know we can find hypocrisy around every corner and
yeah,
in every mirror. But it's
yes, my hand is
yeah.
raised. Yeah, yeah,
But the thing that I will say is that the experience of I think obviously because I have like personal relationships with the people that I'm importing, like it makes me feel like I'm in communication with them when I drink their wines here, and even if I can't like be
mm,
with them, which I would love to because they're like I love them. This is a problem with doing business with people that you love, you end up loving. It's like it makes it difficult, but um it feels like you're in, the back of someone's winery in Georgia or like on some beautiful field in the Loire or, and that's, I think the thing about trying to figure out the offsets is to sort of, a certain level of hypocrisy is inevitable, but to minimize the effect of it, as much as possible. And sort of, I
yeah.
mean, what can we do?
I think I can help answer that question by saying, yeah, like you're right. I mean, if you're looking purely at the ecological stuff, sure, it's problematic, but like you've already said, there's ways to offset those problems in very realistic ways, like very important ways too. That like basically buy that carbon back from the atmosphere
Mm-hmm.
and put it back where it should be. And those are great options. I think those are really good options. I just noticed because I was shipping some wine that UPS now has, like, you just tick a box
Mm-hmm.
and add like pennies on the dollar to do a zero carbon delivery. Like they're now integrating that into the
For
options,
sure. I mean,
which I
many
think is
companies are.
fabulous.
It is,
Yeah.
and carbon offsets aren't like the be all end all, you know what I mean? They're still like
Right.
I mean, it's
Right.
always better to assume, to assume that anything that you calculate is like it's going to be like at least 12% or 20% more than that, you know what I mean, from the things that you're not
Right.
integrating. It's like the amount of
Right.
plastic that you're using when you're like wrapping a pallet, it's like that breaks my heart every time I see.
Yeah.
But
Very good point.
there's so
Yeah.
many there's so much potential for development within this industry, and I just don't think there's been like huge innovation in a way that's my sister actually, this is all, I have a very influential older sister who this is her job. She works basically in she was working in like sustainable like impact investment, and now she works on like the product end of things in terms of sustainability. So she's kind of like an expert within her field, and keeps sending me new products. And last week she sent me a thing about like a reusable shipper for a case of wine. So I was like, how can I, thinking about how I can integrate that into, if I do direct to consumer, it's too
Yeah. Sort of like
expensive,
the old,
to do on a large scale,
right.
but like it could be like a luxury option. So if somebody wants to
Like the,
pay
like,
for return
like the
shipping,
milkman
for
option.
sure, which is like, okay, so we can only, this is, and becomes problematic again. So you can only participate in this like offset economy, in this like economy of righteousness, if you have the funds to do it. If you've basically
Have
right,
money.
and the
Yeah.
money, it's like, where do you get that? Did you exploit somebody? I don't know. So you know,
You know what? Like, we don't probably have the answers today, but I think, I mean, part of what I really believe in doing is bringing them up honestly,
mm,
because we're never going to get to those answers unless we do. Like, if we try to be hypocritical and claim that we're, and greenwash things and claim that everything's wonderful with organic or with natural or whatever, then you ignore the real problems and never solve them. And I think, yeah, you bring up some really good stuff that immediately when I hear you talk about this stuff, like I just want to start tangenting and brainstorming ways that we can like come up with alternative packaging or new ways of pallet shipping. And everything that you said just to me is like, oh, what could we do with that, what can we do with
yeah,
that? So I think that's very important, and like hearing that is, I think, a good
for
there.
sure. I mean, there's so much work to be. I will just bring it up just because it's there's so much about the natural wine industry in addition to this, which is alienating to like people of color to women to like anybody who's queer or like within the LGBT spectrum. It's like there's a world in which natural wine is successful, and like there are ways in which it's not. And it's been really moving over the past 6 months or so um, to see sort of the community mobilize around like activism around the Black Lives Matter movement and like education for all the like BIPOC industry members. And it's been like a totally new, we've all been like living in this world where we think because we don't use sulfur, because we farm organically, that we are correct and the other is not, you know?
Right.
And I
Yeah.
mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I was like facilitating a panel and I was like asking some winemakers whether they thought their work was fundamentally political. And they were like, no, 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 never, never, never. We're just making wine. But the act of
Oh,
doing this,
interesting.
I mean, and they're wonderful
Yeah.
friends and wonderful winemakers. I think that the act of farming in this way is fundamentally a political act. It's like when you're taking a stand against like big agriculture, and like when you're
Yeah.
not using those products, when you're basically
Yeah.
like when you're farming, when you're preserving methane, or what I mean, like everything that they're doing is
Yeah. Like
it's active.
allowing for a healthy soil microbiology so that you can sequester carbon
Exactly.
and greenhouse gases and not have pollutive runoff and not be spraying stuff and hurting not just the ecology, but I mean, like it is too common for people to die young of cancer in wine
For sure.
country.
And
And there's a reason for
and
that.
labor practices, obviously, it's like that's another huge the
Yeah.
the cane winery that was just halfway burnt down this week.
Yeah.
There, I went to
Yeah.
visit them years ago. I don't remember 4 years ago, 5 years ago, um and they're like half the people who are responsible for like the vineyard management, like are the same families that have been working there for 20 years. Some of them live on the
Oh, wow.
property and like are all paid
Yeah.
paid like well and like with love. And I was just like, it's
Yeah.
and now two of the houses burned down and the winery is raising money to and these families lost everything. So it's like the winery is like, people have been asking what you can do to help. The first thing you can do is like donate to this GoFundMe for the two families that lost their homes. It's like thinking
That's
about,
great.
and like Cane is a winery, for example. They're in Napa. They're at the top of Spring Mountain. They're making Napa wine. But to me, like if they're not, and like maybe they use some sulfur, but their farming is immaculate, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Organic, aren't they
organic if not
certified?
biodynamic
Yep.
practices,
Yeah. Right.
and like
Yep.
it's all indigenous yeast, and like that's, I guess, the stylistic thing, going back to Tony's wines, is that like fitting everything into a mold of style within the natural wine world is complicated.
Yeah. I've definitely had these conversations on this podcast before about just how, it's interesting to me how if you just look at natural values, you can make wines like Tony makes, where it's a big alcoholic. You could even, you know, whatever. Like it doesn't have to be a certain style, and yet it seems like that style is actually looked down upon. So if it's not acid driven, high alcohol, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not natural. It doesn't mean you added sulfur. It doesn't mean you did bad farming. It just is when you picked,
Mm-hmm.
that's just a stylistic choice. But it seems like there's a stylistic mandate in addition to the philosophical mandates of natural wine, which I think is unfortunate, because I think it should be a little more encompassing. I think especially to broaden its reach, because I think the values of it are so good and worth spreading, that it would make sense to make natural wines that are also sort of broadly palatable to people who are, haven't made that transition to, an orange wine or
Right.
a super low alcohol acid driven, cab. They still want their big fruity cab.
Well, there's
You can
for
make that.
sure, absolutely. I mean, I think two things I'll say about that is that I do think it's because the consumers are relatively new to the field. You know what I mean? Like, there's a difference between the way the consumer is perceiving of natural wine at this point, and the way that the natural wine professional is perceiving of it at this point. Like
Uh-huh. Yeah.
there's a world in
Yeah.
which this is going to change, and like this is the beginning. We're at the beginning of this thing. Everyone's excited about it. They want orange wines and chilled reds, and they want to drink light, easy
Right,
things.
right.
It's also, but I'm thinking about like at Psychic Wines, for example, which is a huge, like a beacon of natural wine in Los Angeles. Like they love ripeness in a wine. They love a little bit of VA.
Okay.
They love a big red, in a way that I've
Yeah.
like been, consistently surprised and moved by. But
That's
yeah,
funny.
and
Yeah.
they're there to sell them to people like by hand, and like they're there to talk about it and celebrate it. They're huge supporters of Tony's and for example, and like it's a different thing. I mean, but I will say that when I was working as a like making wine lists and stuff, there's a especially at Michael's. Like Michael's is a super traditional, old school. It's been open for it. They celebrated their 40th anniversary right after I left, and so
Oh,
their
wow.
regulars there have been, and it's always had like a phenomenal wine program. There were phases of ups and downs, but it's always been sort of a place where people go for like to have that experience. And yet I managed to, it's like you have to be a little subversive. You get people to drink Napa cabs that are farmed organically, are that are made without additional yeast, etc.
Right.
But it just has to, you just have to do more research. You have to taste more wine and like dig for the things that it's not always easy to fill that gap, but there's always something there. I mean, Kane is always somebody I relied on. Like they've
Yeah.
been.
Buy some
Yeah, I
cane,
just
maybe.
moved my stash yesterday from a place that I didn't feel as great about it. But they're getting ready. They're getting ready for the future. But Matthiasen,
He's
yeah, he's
seems
wonderful.
Matthiasen.
No,
Sorry, I
no,
mispronounced his name.
he's a wonderful farmer and makes delicious wines. Raffanelli is another one.
Okay.
And and sometimes it's like it doesn't always have to be. I'm also, I'm every once in a while. I mean, obviously this is a podcast, so it's not private. But I was going to say off the record. There are some exceptions that I'll always make. There's a winery that's called Green and Red in Napa, and the winemaker just passed away like 2 years ago or a year ago, so I don't know what's going on with the winery now, but they've been making the Chez Panisse like house wine since Chez Panisse opened, and like they're
Oh,
in the
wow.
same sort of generation and sort of ideological sect as Alice Waters, as Michael McCarty. Like, they're all like that
Got
early
it.
California cuisine moment.
Yeah.
So representing their wines and like was something that sort of makes sense, even ideologically, even if they're not like, even if they do use they inoculate, or if they, I think like the way that I approach wine, I baseline have things that I believe in, and there,
Yeah.
but just like for every rule with a wine region, there are exceptions. You have to leave room for exceptions. Like there's no room for dogma.
Yeah.
It's boring. I'm like there's life isn't long enough for dogma. I feel like.
That's true. Well, you're that is always refreshing in the natural wine world because I feel like it tends towards dogma. So that's, I think, important. I love I love that.
I will say though that
I I, I
the
mean, like, I'm
alternative,
surprised. Go ahead. Sorry.
is almost, to just go back and defend the natural wine world. I mean, the reason there's dogma is because the alternative is because it's still a fight. One of the things that is very annoying about importing wine is that you
Yeah.
have to and also making wine, you have to get those labels approved and everything. And if you write organic or like natural, or if you write anything about if you try to put a certification on the bottle, then you have to go through like many, many, many extra steps to get that label approved. Whereas like if it's a conventional
Yeah.
wine with like no certification, no ethics, I'll say, then it's the easiest to get approved. Like, so that the status quo is still favored,
Yeah. I guess, and yeah, to be honest about my own bent, I am pretty dogmatic about the viticulture.
Right.
Like winemaking, I'm as lenient as, I'll you can add make a purple. I'm fine with that. If you grew it organically, I'll still taste it. Like I'm okay with
Why?
that. But not my preference, to add make a purple, but like I don't think I can, like the only exception I made to that, it's funny. I had some um a really nice person who came over to pick up some wine and brought a gift bottle of wine, and they were like, do you drink stuff that's not organic? I was like, if it's a gift, of course I will. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm never gonna turn down. That is very sweet, and the thought is much more important than any negative
Of
effect
course, yeah, no.
of that. But yeah, if I'm buying something, I just cannot bring myself to pay for something where glyphosate was used, for
Yeah,
example. I just won't
I
do
just
it.
don't understand why you would,
uh,
like, I think I also have a block in my head where I'm like, why would they do, like, but
I mean, now that it's really inexcusable. There's so much data
well,
now.
it's
It's
also,
crazy.
I mean, there are circumstances that are sort of beyond our control. Like, I will say, for example, this is an extreme example. I was in the West Bank working on another project with a winery out there, and they couldn't pick when they wanted to pick because they couldn't get anybody to pick the grapes because there was basically like so many different reasons because like of like religious
Oh yeah,
factors, because of the occupation, because of this and that, and basically so they had
yeah,
to pick late, and they added acid, and I was like, you know what, I get that, you know like
yeah,
you
yeah. No,
that's like a force
I
majeure
mean,
thing where you like a little bit have to.
and this is, I don't want this to be an advertisement for what I'm doing, but it is like the reason we're doing it is because I really believe, like, let's get a like it. We wouldn't need the labels if we actually listed ingredients. Like, if you can't say natural, but all you added was tartaric, and I can read that in your ingredients label, then I'm cool with
Right,
that. Like, I know that there are many reasons, especially in California, where it's like if you want ripe grapes and you're in the Central Valley or the foothills, you might lose some
right,
acid. Like, it's just it's really hard. I mean, to find balance in California is a real, like, you either have to be able to pick multiple times, so you're picking really acidic grapes and then riper grapes to get the ripeness you need, or and a lot of people don't have that luxury, and there's all kinds of logistical reasons that come into play, even religious reasons here. Like, we harvest from a place that's owned by a Jewish person, and if we wanted to pick on a Saturday and it was a heat wave that weekend and we had to wait and something else was scheduled on Monday, we might wait till Tuesday or Wednesday to get our grapes.
right,
And that's just a reality.
yeah.
Like, and then, the heat would have come and we would have, and things would have,
No, I mean
but
that's reasonable.
yeah,
It's like for at the same time, it's like why then it's a different conversation. Like it's not even within the realm of like you know uh, that's the problem. I guess the ideological sort of like why talk about natural wine then if there are so many other
yeah,
factors. Like can you for example like it's hard to make like even in parts of France like in the Languedoc and Roussillon it's easiest there because of the climate to make natural wine than
yeah,
easier than other parts of France, where they deal with more mildew or they deal with like, more
right,
hail or frost or whatever. So like why doesn't everyone just make wine in the Languedoc and why do they try to do it in Alsace or whatever or in like
right,
or in,
right,
in the Loire, which is like, how many vintages in a row do we hear of half of or 90% of someone's production being lost to hail or frost? It's like,
yeah,
also with climate change, everything's going to change. At the end of the day, you make like yes, it's difficult to get to that acid that you want, but like then that wine isn't going to have that acid. You know what I mean? Like at the end of the day, you're telling the story of a place and a time, and like
right,
that's not what if you do add that acid, then that's not the story anymore. You know what I mean? So it's like it's a
right,
marketing thing.
right,
Like yeah, you have to make your money back. So can you sell that wine without that acid, or do you do something else?
right,
Do you like blend it with some white grapes, or like do you not make do you just like get creative you know
right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's the question. Like, what if you're trying to reflect place, what happens when your place tastes like shit?
yeah, I mean then there's nothing
That
then
year.
the great thing about distillation is that there's always
There's
there's you,
that
you can always
option,
make
right?
like in Georgia they use the grape must and they make something called cha-cha, which means skins basically, and it's
Nice.
like burning fire water, a real and everywhere you go, you have to drink their cha-cha. It's the best one, of course. So all day, every day in Georgia, you end up drinking little shots of like
Is it mellowed in anything
no.
or flavored with
Oh
anything?
no, it's
Just straight up.
just like grappa basically, but like
Just
50,
it's like,
what is it?
oof,
50 proof or something, 48,
oh my
like completely
God.
just like
Yeah.
fire water. Anyway, there's a whole methodology for drinking it so that you don't scream afterwards, but it's there's
That sounds like
always
a fun
somewhere to
tradition.
put the grapes, if it
Yeah.
doesn't work
Yeah.
out.
Well, right now, hand sanitizer
Yeah.
apparently is another big one. Well, on a brighter note,
Mhm.
I love the motto that you have on the website for Roni Selects: natural wine by heroes for heroes. And I wanted you to just talk about why that? Like why, I mean, first of all, why did you fall in love with natural wine? And then what does that motto mean to you? And why are these people heroic? And then if you're on a roll, I'd love to hear stories about some of them, some of the people you work
Sure.
with and some of the amazing things that they're doing. And I mean, because you did say, like when you're drinking their wine, it's like you're in conversation with them, like and I think wine, that's one of the great things about
Mhm.
wine, especially when it's made beautifully like that. And um, I'm guessing that's part of what draws you and drew you to natural wine. But you know, go on. I would love to hear more about that motto and the people that make it up.
Well, it's a funny thing. I like wrote that very quickly, and I like didn't think about it, and then I've been asked about it many times, and I guess it does resonate.
You put less thought into it than I'm asking you to put into it
But
now,
I've
is
had
what
to
you're
think
saying.
about it since, so it's a don't
Okay.
worry.
Got it. Okay, cool.
So so the first time, I was living in New York before I moved to Los Angeles, and I was, and this is the time when like all of my friends were working at like Marlowe and Sons and Diner and all of those places, and I was like starting to drink these wines, and starting to sort of like get interested in them and become and I started working at a restaurant called the Musket Room, and it's still open in
Mm.
it's in Alita, New York, and it's wonderful. There was a chef from New Zealand, and the wine list was run by, or at least consulted on, by the at the time the only master somm from New Zealand. So he was bringing in all these winemakers from all over New Zealand to just come in, huge education um, about New Zealand wines and just generally about like it
Mm.
was just like a deep dive. And there was a woman who this is just like a very distinct experience. So I'm telling you this whole backstory. So um, this woman named Erin Scala, who's a somm, she's actually on that podcast with Levy Dalton. Um,
Yeah. That's why her name
yeah,
sounds
so
familiar, right?
she's like a
She's like
wonderful.
the silent
Exactly,
partner,
yeah, and she
right?
does a lot of the like history stuff, and she's a wonderful educator, and is now working in Virginia doing stuff with Virginia Wine. Anyway, the point is that at some point I like won some sort of prize or something. I sold this amount of wine, or like I like got the best score on a quiz or something. I don't remember what it was. Anyway, I like earned myself a bottle of wine, whatever wine from the list I chose, and I chose a bottle from a winery called Clos Fantine and in Fougères in France. And I remember so clearly she said, "Okay, when you open this is what's called a natural wine. When you open this, there might be some trapped carbonation, so you should decant it or like shake it around at least." And I remember opening it and drinking it and being like, "Whoa, look at this trapped carbonation!" Like this totally, this was a couple of. I remember this is the first time I was just like, "Oh, this is different from everything else,"
Mm.
and then but I was at the time like sort of exploring different regions and everything with in terms of ideology, like I was raised by like ideologue farmers basically on my mom's side. They're all my parents are from Israel, and my mom grew up in a kibbutz, which is like an agricultural like commune more or less. Now they're all privatized and it's a totally different thing, but my grandfather, basically,
Right.
when I was growing up, he would write us letters every week, and it was just all about the weather and what was happening with the fields. And I was always like, "This is so boring. Like, this is why why don't you talk about like anything fun, like family gossip or whatever?" But
Meanwhile, he was subliminally imprinting you,
exactly,
and it's deep in your blood.
deep in my blood
Here
to
you
just like
are.
talk about soil. You know what I mean? all day, every day. And, and so, and he was never, it was like a big, it was big. There was no talk about like organic farming or anything within that realm.
Right.
It was, anyway, but so when I started, I was just constantly thinking about all sorts of issues around agriculture and like larger scale and labor and things like that. They're all big lefty activists, and so I come from a background of people who are thinking about the holistic, I guess. And when I started working with wine, I was like, this is the only thing that makes sense. It does, for me personally, it didn't make sense to like support wineries that weren't thinking the same way that I do. And
Yeah.
it's like, so it just became sort of it was an easy, it wasn't a sort of active choice. It was just like, this is the thing that I do. You know what I mean? It helped also
Yeah.
that when I came to Los Angeles, my first job was working at Domaine LA. So I got a good initial
Oh,
education
that's
into
great.
the
Yeah.
sort of natural wine scene in Los Angeles. And I was like, these are people, this is a place I want to like support and be a part of.
Yeah.
And then your second question is about, I mean, the idea of heroic agriculture is something that I find very romantic. You know what I mean? People talk about it in terms of, or viticulture, heroic viticulture, and in like when you farm in a crazy place that's very steep, or just like all these things that people have to do to make grapes beautiful.
Yeah.
And it's like, I
Bring it full circle back to those elements that are out of our control as well.
exactly,
Like, I mean, when you see what farmers who have the limited tools that you have, if you're trying to be very natural and organic, it's like and even if not, like, I mean, a lot of people, hail affects everybody
yeah.
regardless of what you're spraying on your vineyard, and it's yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, and in that sense, it's like there's always, obviously, with the limited tools, you talk to a biodynamic farmer and they have an answer for everything. There's like people who
Yeah.
live within
Yeah.
this realm of the
Yeah,
ethereal.
I use that. That's right, and I should say, like, limited tools. I should use that with quotations, because I think that's a little bit of like an anti-organic, biodynamic refrain that you hear a lot, and I don't think it's that true. I mean, I think they're just different tools, and maybe harder tools, more hands-on
And
tools.
in the end, I
Um,
mean, like also, not only is it an ideological thing, I also do believe that like you can taste the difference between a living wine, like a living object, and a dead object. And like
yeah,
there's there's energy, and not to whatever, I'm gonna go there. I mean, I work with a bunch of people who like literally
yeah,
plan everything by the moon phases. So no matter what I say, it's less extreme than the world that they live in. So I do think that there is a transfer of energy in a way between, when somebody, and it's the same thing. It's like, I come from an art background also. And it's like when you can feel the physical transfer of energy into an object, it like generates meaning, and
yeah,
that's, and it might be unconscious, or it might be like not physical, something sort of like otherworldly, but I do think that it exists. Or even if it doesn't exist, I have the fantasy of it existing, so it exists. So like that's
yeah,
the way brains work. So like my brain has made this thing for me, this like fantasy for me, so I'm going to indulge in it because it feels good you know and
yeah,
in terms of like the heroic thing, yeah, it is like I do believe that like everybody who like farms a plot of land is doing something like pretty magical. You know what I mean? It's like no matter what, they're difficult. And then in terms of the
no, but
consumer, like, you're buying into this thing. So you're, making it possible for those people to continue their work. The reason I do what I do is to help the people that I'm working with, the producers that I'm working with, keep doing what they're doing.
yeah.
Um,
It loud. I think that's a really important part, and something that I always try to emphasize, is just like the power of the consumer to make these beautiful things happen just by the choice that you go in. You're like, oh, I'll have this with dinner tonight,
right.
you know. But that, like, I guess, going back to what I was saying about the whole supply chain that made that possible for you to make that choice, and then the people, the beautiful thing that's happening at the other end of that chain that created that thing that you're able to drink.
Mm-hmm.
It's yeah, that's all part, that you're directly connected that.
It's a real that yeah, and it becomes it's like a. I feel now I just started working with the Go Boy, which is wonderful, and there's so many producers in it who I've sort of I was working with their wines from when I could, as soon as I could choose what wines went somewhere, I started selling these wines, and it's like a huge honor for me to be able to work with a lot of these, and the winemakers that I import directly. They're I do look up to them as like their knowledge, their understanding of or they're very good at what they do. So, I guess, which is a good transition to some of the people that I work with.
I was just gonna
Yeah,
say, yeah, go for it.
I mean,
Yeah, I would love to hear about, some of these some of the craziest things that some of the craziest vineyards or projects or whatever is happening, or beautiful, or however,
yeah.
whatever sticks out.
There's I mean, it's like I could talk about a lot of things, like Colombia, who's in Tuscany. I've never seen such healthy soil. It's unbelievable. I was it's like super deep red clay with fossils, like huge. All of that area many, many millions of years ago was ocean floor, and there are these huge like fossilized seashells that are like the size of two. You have to hold them with two hands that come out of the soil.
Wow.
And one side they're farming biodynamically, like extra, extra, extra. Every time I talk to them, they tell me something about the moon, which is always elegant and the warmest, most wonderful people. And they have their vineyard on one side of this sort of hill, and on the other side they have two horses, two like gorgeous old like sort of sturdy workhorses that balance the energy from the vines.
Oh, wow.
So it's like all sort of the whole property is like a living ecosystem that's like balanced energetically as well. That's one cool thing. I mean, I work with a woman in Georgia.
What are they making before you move on from them? What kind of wine are they
making? I mean, they have a couple of different cuvées. They make their like Rosso Toscana is like Sangiovese and a couple of different grapes, and they have like many different vintages. And then they make a skin contact Trebbiano, Malvasia blend, some sparkling wine, some rosé.
Nice. So sort of classic for that area, but in their own style.
And
kind of thing.
Definitely, they're very, very elegant wines, and they every vintage, of the same cuvée. My first like shipment from them was like 4 different vintages of the same cuvée, and they were like remarkably different and very like well priced, and and they all go through different phases. So it's like nice to watch them, open a bottle of the vintage that you liked the least or whatever, and it's changed into this like completely other thing. So it's they're very, very they're in motion. This one of the people I work with in Georgia. Her name is Tamuna. She works under the label Corta Vebes Marani. And now she's starting her own label, Tamuna's Wine. And she's doing something that like nobody else in Georgia is doing, which is she planted this vineyard that's like a little plot, like maybe a hectare or something. That's 35 different grape varieties, 34 indigenous Georgians, and one like Muscat from the Ukraine, and blends that entire plot into one wine. And it's just called 35 Grapes. And it's like a neon pink color. Like every year it's a little bit different, but it's honestly one of my favorite wines that I work with altogether. It's like I never, there's not a lot of it. And this year we got all of it, and it's like not very much, and so it's definitely it's just like a special object that like is more complex than it looks by like 1,000 times. And just, it's like bubblegum pink, and it's like all these crazy indigenous grapes from Georgia.
Oh, wow.
And she, nobody really, people blend grapes there, but it's like not as common. So it's to blend 35 is like pretty radical. Cool. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one. Another one, I mean, let's go to France. There's one guy that I work with. His name is Eric Com. And I went to visit him. I basically found him on the internet. Also, this is like a lot of traveling around in Europe in a car is just like finding the next person that you're going to visit on the internet and calling them and hope they say yes, And I went there with my partner who speaks fluent French, and my French is not, which is very useful. My French is like wine, it's I can get by talking about wine and like making a couple jokes here and there, but Eric is like,
lucky you to have a good
it's good
French-speaking partner. That was smart picking. I mean,
I got lucky. Anyway, Eric, we drove up to the house, and he was like this gruff kind of guy, maybe in his late 20s, early 30s, maybe mid 30s, who knows, on a tractor, and like he brought us into his house and it was just like caving in. Like the house is it was built in the 13th century. It's just like the ceiling is like ovular almost. It's just like
wow.
the house is old. And we were, he was telling us about his family. They've been making wine there for generations, and he was the first. His father makes wine, and he makes wine with his father, but also on his own. And so, they're part of the like Alsace wine trail. So while we were in the tasting room, and he was like, "You're only allowed to taste my natural, like the vin nature, and you're not allowed to taste." I was like, "I'm curious about the conventional wines," and he was like, "No, you're not allowed to taste those. You're only going to taste these." And there was like another couple that walked in. It's like Belgian or something. And they were there to taste the conventional wines, and so he had to do this like side by side, like tourist tasting of, and he was like, "No, you won't like these natural wines that they're tasting. Don't worry." But we drove away. As we were driving away, and we like looked at each other and we were like, "Wow, this guy's gonna be a star." Like his wines were just so good, and like he's just totally nuts. And since now every time his wines arrive, they're like almost sold out by the time they basically get inbounded. It's like he's
Name?
Eric Kamm. It's Kamm, and he's like got all these like anarchy symbols. He's kind of like I think he doesn't like to leave his house, but he's also like a crust punk, basically, like kind of like in that, like he wishes he could like be an anarchist, but he like doesn't leave his house.
That's awesome.
I mean, there are a lot. There's so many different people. It's like many big personalities. There's I mean, I could go on, but there's, I don't know. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, thank you. No, this is great. I want to end on a high point. That's why I was hoping your tales of the producers would be, which sounds great. Thank you so much for your time and for, talking about all this stuff. This has been great.
It's such a pleasure.
Really
Thanks for having
getting to
me.
know you and what you're doing. If people want to learn more, or if you want people to get in touch with them, what would you suggest?
You can always go. My email is on the website. It's just roniselects.com, RONI, or our Instagram, which is the same, Roni_selects or dash or something like that. You can always. It's a small company, so no matter what, you'll find a way to get in contact with me through one of those means. Nobody else is looking at those messages, so.
Great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you so much
cool.
again.
Well, thank you. Of course, my pleasure, truly. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Roni Ginach of Roni Selects. Thank you so much for listening. I definitely don't take your time and attention for granted. Unlike many other podcasts, we don't ask for donations. But if you value this podcast and want to support it, the easiest and most yummy way to do that is to buy a bottle of Centralis wine. Centralis is my winery, and I started it to provide delicious organically grown wine and to promote organic regenerative values. One of the ways Centralis promotes those values is by sponsoring this podcast. So if you buy Centralis wines, you get delicious wine and support this podcast. You can buy Centralis wines at centraliswine.com. That's CENTRALAS wine.com. Thank you.